You're about to hear the story titled, Her Father Sold Her Like Property. But the rancher who took her in broke every rule. This isn't just a tale of survival, it's a story of quiet strength, unexpected kindness, and a bond forged in silence on the unforgiving frontier. What began as a transaction soon turned into something no one saw coming. The wind never stopped. It howled across the Nebraska prairie like a wounded spirit, dragging dust and forgotten voices with it. Thomas Calloway listened to it from the edge of his porch, the hem of his coat flapping like tired sails. The land stretched before him, vast and indifferent, a worn-out world that had matched the hollowness in his chest for 3 long years. 3 years since the fever stole everything his wife Sarah, their baby boy, grief had hollowed him out, left him dry and sand-scraped like the land itself. He'd withdrawn from life, carving out a lonely rhythm on his small ranch, wake, tend the cattle, mend what broke, eat, sleep, repeat. His neighbors were a day's ride away. The nearest town was just a cluster of buildings pressed up against the railway line, dusty, small, full of eyes that whispered. He visited only when absolutely necessary. That spring morning, the routine was broken. A tired rider approached, spooked horse trailing dust, and handed over a grimy envelope. The seal was broken, the paper stained. The message inside, though brief, shifted something inside Thomas a weight, sharp and strange. Brody. The name itself brought bile to his throat. A trader with no conscience, a man who sold everything from hides to horses. To people they'd met once. That was enough. The letter said he had something to offer. A Cheyenne woman, young, healthy, quiet. Her name was Nahili. Her father had sold her to settle a debt. Brody would be passing through in 3 days and offered Thomas the chance to take her. Just like that strong Indian pony you bought once, the letter joked, as if she were the same. He even added, might be useful around the ranch. Useful? Thomas gripped the paper so tightly it crinkled and tore. He wanted to throw it in the fire. He wanted to pretend he'd never read it, but he didn't, because while the idea of buying another human being was revolting, he also knew Brody, knew what would happen if he said no. Nahili would be passed to someone crueler, someone who saw her not as a person, but as property, a thing, a body. And so, for the first time in months, he didn't sleep well. He paced, he stared at the fire until his eyes burned. On the 3rd day, when the sun barely broke through the gray horizon, he stood by the corral with a pouch of coins in his coat and a stone in his stomach. Brody came, alas before sunset. His wagon creaked up the hill, casting long shadows across the prairie. The trader hopped down with his usual swagger. Calloway, he bellowed, got her right here, good stock, quiet. Behind the wagon, a thin figure stood tied to a lead rope. She wore a blanket far too thin for the cold. Her head was bowed, dark hair tangled, face hidden. Thomas didn't speak. He stared at her, at the shape of her, human, not livestock, not stock. Name's Nahili, Brody continued, patting the rope like a leash. Doesn't talk much. Don't need to. Just keep her fed and she keep her head down. Thomas opened the pouch and counted out the coins. He didn't look at Brody's greedy hands. Every clink felt like a strike to his soul. Brody grinned as he climbed back onto his wagon. Pleasure doing business. Then he was gone, wheels kicking up dust into the cold dusk. Thomas was left alone with her. The wind tugged at her blanket. She hadn't moved, not a word, not a sound. He cleared his throat. Nahili, he said softly, tasting the name. It felt too sacred to be said after what had just happened. She flinched, just a little. My name is Thomas, he spoke slowly, gesturing to the cabin. House, warm, food. She raised her head. Finally, her eyes met his, dark, tired, wounded. But there was something else there too. A spark, a question. He didn't press. He turned and walked toward the cabin, giving her space. After a few moments, he heard the soft crunch of her footsteps following. The door creaked open to a space that smelled of wood smoke and old dust. Inside, one bed, One table, two chairs, a fire, clean, but bare, a man's house without need for softness. Thomas gestured toward the hearth. Sit, he said gently. She hesitated, then moved to the fire, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. She folded into a quiet ball near the flames. He could feel her watching him, silent, unreadable. He busied himself with the fire, stoked it, and began preparing food. Salted pork, dried beans, simple fare. He worked slowly, aware of her eyes, trying not to seem large or threatening. He knew this situation was wrong in a dozen ways, but he couldn't fix the world. He could only offer this woman safety, warmth, and choice, things she likely hadn't had in a long time. He placed a tin plate beside her. Eat. She looked at him, then the food. Her hands were slow, unsure, but once she tasted it, she ate. Quickly, like someone who wasn't sure when the next meal would come. He turned away, giving her privacy, and sat at the table. When she finished, he took her plate and cleaned it with his own. He gestured toward a corner where a rolled-up blanket and canvas lay. There, he said. For you, she said nothing. Didn't move. I won't harm you, he added, voice low and slow. Finally, when he lay down on his bed, fully clothed and facing the wall, he heard her blanket rustle. The floor creaked. She lay down too. That night, the cabin was filled with silence, but not the kind Thomas had grown used to. This silence carried weight, a shared uncertainty, not fear, not quite, but something unspoken, hovering in the firelight.in. That uncertain quiet. Thomas closed his eyes and whispered to himself, whatever this is, it has to be better than what she came from. The morning came cold and pale. A thin frost blanketed the prairie, and smoke curled softly from the chimney of Thomas Calloway's cabin. Inside, the silence lingered like a cautious truce. Nahili was still asleep on the makeshift pallet he'd laid out for her, wrapped in her worn blanket, knees tucked close, a figure so small and still she might have vanished into the floorboards if he hadn't looked twice. Thomas stirred the fire and set water to boil, moving quietly so he wouldn't startle her. She didn't stir until the smell of hot beans filled the air. When she did, she sat up slowly, watching him with those same unreadable eyes. He set a plate near the hearth. Eat, he said simply. She did, silently, with the slow, measured movements of someone who had learned not to take anything for granted. They spoke no words that morning, but something unspoken passed between them, an agreement. Perhaps he wouldn't press her, she wouldn't run. For now, that was enough. The days began to fall into a rhythm. Thomas worked the ranch, mending fences, feeding cattle, hauling water. Nahili remained mostly inside or just outside the cabin, sweeping, scrubbing, cleaning. She worked with surprising precision, scouring the floors until the wood looked almost new, washing the tin plates until they gleamed. Her hands were quick and quiet, her feet nearly soundless on the floorboards. She still didn't speak, but she listened, watched, understood more than she let on. Sometimes, when he returned after a long day on horseback, he'd find the cabin tidier than he'd left it. A small pile of firewood stacked near the door, or fresh water drawn from the well. Once, he noticed she had sewn a tear in one of his shirts and hung it near the fire to dry. He didn't ask her to do any of it. One afternoon, while repairing a sagging fence post near the corral, the post refused to settle straight. He wrestled with it, frustrated, until he suddenly felt a pressure from the other side. Nahili was there holding the post steady without a word. He looked at her, surprised. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded once, a simple gesture. But it was the first time she'd responded to his words with anything other than stillness. From that day on, she began to step outside more often, not to talk, not to socialize, but to help in subtle, meaningful ways. When he returned from the fields one evening with a gash on his hand from barbed wire, she motioned him to sit, disappeared into the cabin, and returned with a strip of cloth and a jar of something that smelled of wild herbs. She wrapped his hand carefully, never meeting his eyes, but her touch was steady. "Sure, where did you learn that?" he asked gently. She didn't answer. But in her silence, he began to understand that her world, her people, had taught her much more than anyone in town would ever credit her for. He found himself watching her, just as she watched him. She moved like someone used to hardship, yet still graceful. She never complained. She never asked for anything. And slowly, cautiously, she began to make the cabin her own. She cleared the windows of soot, letting in more light. She arranged the few spare items, utensils, baskets, old books into a kind of quiet order. She even stepped outside one afternoon and traced a shape in the dirt near the porch with her finger, as if planning something. Later, that week, she began digging small holes along the edge of the cabin. Curious, Thomas asked, "What are you doing?" She glanced at him and said one word, the first he'd heard her speak clearly: "Flowers." He blinked. "Flowers." She nodded. The image stayed with him all day. A woman sold like cattle, now planting beauty into a place built on grief. It humbled him. During his next trip to town, he bought a thicker blanket and a handful of apples. He ignored the sideways looks from the general store owner and the whispers in the saloon. The rumors had already begun. Calloway had taken in a Cheyenne girl, they said. Bought her, like property. He didn't care what they thought. When he returned and handed Nahili the blanket and fruit, she took them without a smile, but her fingers lingered a moment on the edge of the fabric, her eyes flicking to his and away again. That evening, as the fire crackled and the wind rattled the windows, Thomas sat at the table, polishing the butt of his old rifle. Nahili sat by the fire with a piece of thread, mending a torn glove. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them had shifted, no longer cold or filled with fear, but comfortable. A shared space. He looked at her, at the way her hair fell loosely over one shoulder, at the way she had begun to breathe easier in this place, and he realized something had changed. This wasn't about guilt anymore, or penance, or trying to make right what the world had done wrong. This was about two broken people finding a kind of peace in each other's presence. Not love, not yet, but something like the soil before the seed. He said softly, "You can stay as long as you want." Nahili didn't respond, but she kept sewing, and when she finished, she set the glove gently on the table in front of him, then returned to her place near the fire. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside the cabin, a quiet warmth had taken root. The quiet peace that had begun to settle between them didn't go unnoticed. The prairie was vast, but the town was close enough for whispers to travel like wildfire. News of Thomas Calloway bringing a Cheyenne woman into his home spread fast, faster than any cattle stampede. When Thomas rode into town for supplies, the air shifted. He felt it in the sideways glances, the conversations that stopped mid-sentence as he passed, the way the saloon door didn't creak, it slammed. He tied his horse outside and stepped into the dusty little store. The merchant behind the counter offered a stiff nod. "Calloway, need flour, coffee, and salt," Thomas said evenly. "And apples," he added after a pause. "Apples?" The merchant asked, raising an eyebrow. "For someone back home," Thomas said without explaining. He kept his tone flat, but he could feel the weight behind the silence that followed. Outside the store, Miller and a few others leaned against the porch rail, watching him like buzzards eyeing a wounded animal. "You really did it, huh?" Miller called as Thomas loaded the goods onto his saddle. "Did what?" Thomas replied without looking up. "Bought yourself a squaw. Heard Brody sold you one like she was a mule." The other men chuckled darkly. Thomas didn't flinch. "She works for me," he said calmly. "Works? Huh?" One of them sneered. "Heard she don't talk much." "Maybe you like that." Miller stepped closer. He stank of whiskey and rot. "Calloway, folks around here don't think much of what you're doing. Ain't natural, ain't Christian. Bringing one of them into your home like she's your wife. She's under my roof, and she's not to be bothered," Thomas replied. His voice was low, firm, dangerous. Miller grabbed his arm. "What is she then, Calloway, your pet, or your bed warmer." That was the line? Thomas didn't think he reacted. His fist collided with Miller's jaw, sending the man reeling backward into the dust. The others lunged forward, and chaos erupted. Fists flew, shirts tore, blood spilled into the dry street. Thomas fought like a man with something to protect, not himself, but someone else. Someone who had already survived too much. By the time the sheriff showed up, half the men were groaning on the ground, nursing bruises and cracked ribs. "Calloway." The sheriff barked. "What in tarnation?" "They threatened my home," Thomas said through blooded lips. "I made sure they wouldn't again." The sheriff sighed, eyeing the mess. "Go home, Calloway. I don't want to see either of you in town for a while." Thomas didn't argue. He mounted his horse, wincing at the pain in his side, and rode back toward the prairie. When he reached the cabin, night had already fallen. A warm light glowed through the window. He dismounted slowly, every bruise complaining, and opened the door. Nahili was crouched near the fire, cooking something that smelled of roots and broth. She looked up sharply when he entered, eyes widening at the sight of his torn shirt and bruised face. She rose, hesitated, then crossed the room to him. Her hand reached out, fingers ghosting across the cut on his cheek. He didn't speak. Neither did she, but something passed between them, understanding. Not surprise, not fear, less concern, and something else, too, recognition. He had fought. For her, he hadn't had to, but he did, without a word. Nahili turned and fetched a cloth and a bowl of water. She sat him down by the fire and began cleaning the cuts on his face with quiet, steady hands. Her touch was gentle, but confident, like someone used to mending wounds both seen and unseen. Thomas watched her in the flickering light. This woman, silent, strong, unknown, had become a part of his world, his home, and for the first time, he realized she had begun to see it as her home too. Not just a place to hide, but a place she was willing to protect. He didn't say thank you. The words felt too small. Instead, he reached up and lightly touched her hand. "Nahili," he said quietly. She met his eyes, no longer distant, no longer cold. She didn't pull away. That night, they sat by the fire long after the meal was done. No words, just the sound of the wine outside, the crackle of flames, and the slow breath of two people beginning to trust again. The peace between them was no longer silent, it was sacred. Peace on the prairie was a fragile thing. It could be shattered by a gust of wind, a careless whisper, or the sound of horses in the night. Though the bruises on Thomas Calloway's face faded, the threat behind them did not. Word had spread beyond the saloon men in town didn't like what he had done. They saw Nahili not as a woman, but as a disruption to what they believed was right and proper. They said he had defied nature, religion, race. They couldn't understand what had taken root between him and the Cheyenne woman in the quiet walls of his home, because it had grown without permission. At first, they were only rumors. Then came the warnings. Fence posts knocked down, bullet holes in the barn siding, a dead coyote left on the porch. Then one moonless night, the sound of hooves rumbled across the prairie like thunder. Thomas had been expecting something. He wasn't caught off guard. He ushered Nahili into the root cellar, his most fortified place, handing her a lantern and the pistol he'd cleaned earlier that day. "Stay quiet. Don't come out unless I come for you," he whispered. She didn't argue, but before he shut the door, she gripped his wrist. Her fingers trembled. Her eyes did and single quotes T. Thomas positioned himself at the front window, rifle in hand. He could hear low voices outside, men laughing, daring one another. Then, the door exploded inward. 3 men charged into the cabin, silhouetted in the firelight. Thomas fired. One dropped. The others ducked and scrambled for cover. Furniture crashed, glass shattered. Then he heard a second commotion near the back. The cellar. Fear stabbed through him. He pushed past one attacker, crashing through the rear doorway, just in time to see 2 men tugging at the cellar entrance. One held a lantern, the other a crowbar. "Leave her alone." he roared, raising his rifle, but before he could fire, the shot came from underground. A sharp crack split the air. One of the men fell with a scream, clutching his leg. The lantern dropped, shattering. Flames licked the dry grass near the cabin wall, and then she was there. Nahili emerged from the dark like smoke, her long hair wild, her eyes blazing. She held a burning brand from the hearth and swung it low at the remaining intruder, catching him across the knee. He screamed and fell back. Thomas didn't hesitate. He struck the man nearest him with the butt of his rifle, knocking him unconscious inside. He shouted together. They darted back through the broken door, slamming it behind them. The attackers, confused, bleeding, panicked by their own fire, fled into the night. Thomas leaned against the wall, breath ragged, his ribs throbbing. Nahili stood beside him, chest heaving, the torch still in her hand. In that moment, he didn't see the frightened girl Brody had delivered. He saw a warrior. He looked at her, really looked. You didn't stay in the cellar. She didn't smile, but her eyes held fire. I wasn't going to let them find me helpless, he exhaled. You saved us both. She stepped closer, touched his shoulder lightly. We saved each other. Later, after putting out the flames and boarding up the windows, they sat by the fire in the damaged cabin. The silence between them wasn't shaken. It was solid, earned. Thomas turned to her. I brought you here thinking I was protecting you. But you're not someone who needs saving, are you? She shook her head slowly. Not anymore. The danger hadn't passed. They both knew the men would remember this night. Remember the shame of being beaten by a heathen woman and the man who stood beside her. But neither of them spoke of fear. That night, Thomas didn't retreat to his bed as he usually did. He sat with her until the fire burned low. And when their fingers brushed for the first time on purpose, neither of them pulled away. In the weeks that followed the night of the attack, the ranch became something else entirely. Not just a shelter. Not just a place to survive. It became theirs. Thomas and Nahili fell into a rhythm that no longer felt built on necessity or obligation. They worked side by side, fencing, chopping wood, tending the livestock. She showed him how to read the sky better than any farmer's almanac, taught him which roots and herbs could soothe fever or dull pain. He, in turn, showed her how to break a horse gently, how to mend a broken stirrup. They rarely spoke of the past. She never mentioned her father. He didn't bring up Brody, or the letter, or the way the world had failed them both. But the unspoken things found their way into their actions. One evening, while they were gathering wildflowers near the ridge, Nahili paused and turned to him. You tried to give me safety, she said. He blinked. It was the most she'd ever said in a single breath. I didn't want that life they offered me, she continued. The sail, the silence, I didn't choose it, but this, here. I chose to stay. Thomas's voice cracked when he replied. And I didn't just bring you here to be forgiven for the world's cruelty. I wanted to do right by you, but I didn't expect this. She stepped forward and touched his chest just once over his heart. You gave me space to breathe again, she said. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the first hints of frost painted the glass, they sat close by the fire, not as strangers bound by tragedy, not as master and servant, but as something new, something neither of them had words for, but both had begun to understand. He reached for her hand. She didn't flinch. They no longer needed the separate beds, but the world outside had not forgotten them. The men in town stopped their gossip. At least opally, the beating they received from Thomas and the firebrand of Nahili had sent a message. The whispers grew quieter, the stares less bold. Still, they were warnings. Shots in the night, a rider spotted watching from a distant ridge, threats that the land might be taken, that Calloway's claim might be challenged. But this time, Thomas wasn't alone in his defense. Nahili stood with him at the fence line one dawn as they watched smoke curl in the distance. Someone burning brush near the boundary of their land. They'll test us again, Thomas muttered. Nahili didn't look away. Then we'll stand again. It wasn't bravado. It was belief. the seasons turned. Snow fell and melted, wild flowers bloomed again. The garden Healy planted at the front of the cabin grew small patches of color in a once colorless place. Inside the home, change came slowly, then all at once, a rug on the floor, herbs hanging from the ceiling, her handmade satchel resting beside his boots by the door, his rifle beside her bow. They moved like people who had always shared space, always known each other's silences. And then one crisp autumn evening, after a simple dinner and a long moment of quiet, Thomas looked at her across the fire and asked, "Do you think this what we've made is real?" Healy tilted her head. "You mean love?" He nodded. She smiled, a rare, soft smile. "Yes, but not the kind people talk about in stories." "No," he agreed. "The kind built from fire and bruises and planting things that might never grow." She reached across the table and took his hand. "It's the kind that does grow," she said. "Even in soil everyone gave up on." That winter, the ranch became a home in truth. They repaired the damage from the attack, rebuilt stronger, together. When spring came again, Thomas carved something onto the front porch beam. Just one word? Healy. Not a mark of ownership. A declaration. She belonged there. Not because he had bought her, because she had chosen to stay, and he had chosen to become something new. Not just a man recovering from loss, but a man who had learned how to love, not with grand gestures but with quiet, daily reverence.